Hello everyone, welcome back to the course. So in the past class we tried to understand how energy was getting produced through a couple of renewable and clean sources of energy and how it was linked to hydrogen energy as well. Now in today's class we will try to understand, okay, now we have produced energy either through fossil fuels or so-called renewable sources of energy. How do we consume this energy? Where exactly is this energy going? How is this consumption varying in different countries and in different sectors? This is something we will try to understand in the current class. So, if I talk about the objective of the current class, this would be to become aware of the consumption pattern of energies and also to understand how this consumption pattern differs different countries and different sectors. So, if I would want to list down what could be the sectors which consume a majority of energy globally, I would have to list down first industries. Now this comes in conjugation with the service sector as well. Then there would be residential sector. And finally, there would be the transportation sector. These are the three main consumption avenues where energy is consumed globally. Either it's the industries, the residential sector or the transportation. If I talk about the global bifurcation of the energy, industries tend to consume a vast majority in terms of 45%. Then if I talk about the residential sector, this consumes roughly 20% of the energy and the remaining 35% also goes in the transportation sector. So this is how energy is consumed. But this is also ironical that whenever we talk about energy consumption or energy, new pathways of energy, it's mainly the transportation sector that is a focus. So whenever you're talking about new sources of energy, you will be talking about electric vehicles or other kinds of biofuels. It's really that industries or residential sector comes in the focus. One of the reasons behind this is that we come across a site like this very often, because majority of us live in the cities and this site is quite common, leading to different kinds of fumes getting produced, and not so often basis that we come across site like this. Of course, those of you are coming based in rural areas or near facilities like this site is a common site, but not for the people of the cities. And also one of the things that we often try to consume is the confusion between pollution and CO2 emissions. We tend to confuse the two things. Some of us basically also confuse like the emission problem that we have in the northern part of country during the months of October and November to be the CO2 issue, whereas that is more of a air emission issue getting exaggerated because of the production of different particulate matters and different oxides like SOx and NOx. So we need to understand that energy consumption is very different throughout the different sectors and the different countries. For this, let us go to the IEA website, which basically refers to International Energy Agency. I am also giving here the link where you can explore your own and try to see how this energy sources are consumed in the different sectors. So let us open this website. So here is this website for you that basically gives you a data browser where you can see the different kinds of energy production or consumption and different pathways which you can see. First, let us try to see the energy consumption globally. So if I would want to see how the coal is getting consumed, so you would have the coal consumption by sector. We have a huge coal and this basically goes in the industrial sector and then in the residential sector. What you see, there was a massive rise in the coal consumption during the years 2010 and 2015, and then it has basically normalized back. One of the reasons why coal was used extensively during this decade was the energy production in China. China is one country that is heavily reliant on coal for its energy needs, and this is the time when China became the factory of the world. They were basically manufacturing every other product and this basically consumes energy. They have been using coal like anything, but now they are going towards cleaner alternates and as well as efficient utilization of the same coal, which is basically calling for a decreased consumption of coal for the industrial sector. If I talk about natural gas, you would see the natural gas consumption has been rising, and if I see by the sectors, again it is in the industrial sector, but it is also for the residential sector. it happens to be cleaner, it happens to be cheaper. So many of the countries or the developed part of the world is now shifting from coal to natural gas. Then if I talk about oil consumption by sector, most of you would have guessed it right. It's basically used in the transportation sector. Then there are a few other new non-energy use as well. So when I say non-energy use, I am talking about different kinds of lubricants that go into the vehicles, the different kinds of petrochemicals that are produced. So that is basically the use. Now let us try to compare that with our country. So let us put India in here. Yeah. So now let's have a view of India. So something similar to the world. We are having a good amount of petroleum reserves getting used for the transportation sector. If I go with the coal consumption, it's again in the industrial sector and quite different from the world trajectory. Our coal consumption has been rising. Of course, there was a small kink because of the COVID in the year 2001 or so, but since then there has been an increased coal consumption because our energy needs tend to rise. If I talk about the natural gas, again natural gas majorly we are using it for the non-energy sector. We are not using this much in the industries because most of the natural gas that we have is very small and most of the natural gas is coming as an import. So where do we use it for? It's basically we use for hydrogen production. How hydrogen production? Because the natural gas that we import is used for production of hydrogen, and this hydrogen is then converted into ammonia, which is used for production of different grades of fertilizers. So this is again a normal route which we will be discussing in the later classes. But this was just to give an understanding that there are different sources of energy which are used in a different way for different countries. So this is some purview that I have given for India, but you can look for different countries and there are a lot of information given which can come in handy. You can also have a look at the renewables and waste. So if you see the renewables, this is the share of renewables as it has been rising. And if I talk about the solar PV generation in India, this has been exponentially rising in the past decade or so, and something similar you can see for the wind energy as well. So these are some things that you would want to explore for your own self if you would want to see how the different energy sources are getting utilized. And don't forget to see the units on the y-axis because this could be very different for the fossil fuels and the renewable sources of energy. So if I go with the business as usual scenario, this is how energy consumption is going to increase for the coming 80 years or so. So what you see in front of you is how the energy production is going to be there from the different sources if there are not net zero targets. So this data was derived from an in-house modeling using GCAM modeling, and we can see that in case there are no interventions or policy parameters, these three sources which are the coal, natural gas and oil will continue to dominate the energy supply in the world. So we would have to move towards certain alternates that can be more sustainable, because in the absence of these policy interventions, the world is going to consume these three fuels like anything. With this, we also need to understand the concept of energy poverty. So what is basically energy poverty? Energy poverty refers to not having basic energy needs for electricity as well as clean cooking facilities. So the infographic that you see in front of you basically shows you the quantum of energy poor people globally. If the color of this circle is more towards the red, it means the maximum percentage of that country or the population of that country are energy poor. The more the color of the circle is towards the green, the majority of the people are not energy poor. So if we see majority of the sub-Saharan Africa, we see that the people there are energy poor. But should we be happy in India? Of course, we are having a very green color. Maybe 99% of the people that are living in our country are not energy poor. But we also need to be careful of the diameter. The diameter of the circle basically represents the absolute amount of people that are energy poor. And we in India tend to have one of the maximum or one of the largest amount of energy poor people anywhere in the world. And it is our responsibility to make these people have at least the basic needs to live a dignified life. So if I go with one of the definitions of energy poverty which I found on Wikipedia, of course the different avenues can have different definitions, but they all point out that you should have access to minimum basic energy and clean cooking facility. So who is an energy poor people according to this definition? If you don't have access to 35 kgs of LPG per capita per year. So if you would want to have a comparison, then the normal cooking gas that is supplied to your homes comes in a cylinders which is having 14 to 16 kgs of gas. So this is roughly equivalent to 2 to 3 cylinders in a year. Then you should also have access to roughly 120 units of electricity in an year per capita. Again, this is also not a very great energy need. The normal electricity bill that you are paying for your household, you are normally using for a family of 3 to 4, you are normally consuming 200 odd units every single month. So this is not a very, this is a very liberal definition that could be easily met, and given that you don't have so much amount of basic energy, means you are energy poor. I would also like to share some other statistics with you, which goes as, if I consider globally, 10% people or population lack access to electricity. Roughly 26% lack access to clean cooking facilities. 95% of these people are in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, and 80% of these people are in rural areas. So there is still a huge population that is devoid of these basic facilities, and this is one of the reasons that the energy consumption has risen in the past years and is also expected to rise in the coming few years. And this is what we have seen in the earlier graph as well, that the energy consumption is going to rise steadily from roughly 600 exajoules currently to more than 1200 exajoules by the end of this century, and this energy has to come from somewhere. Why is this rising? One of the major reasons is that still a vast majority of people are energy poor, and they need to be given minimum basic energy needs as well. And this kind of disparity is also reflected by the night sky that we have discussed in the very first class. If we see this again, the night sky, we can see like there are certain parts of the world that are glowing way more than the other parts. Of course, one basic thing to note here is there is a huge population density disparity that we have. But apart from it, we still see that there is a huge part of Africa that is devoid of these energy needs. Further, we also need to understand how this energy is getting used in different countries. So if I talk about the major countries of the world which are listed on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have the individual energy consumption in the terms of exajoule. So let me reiterate that the total global consumption again here is roughly 600 exajoules, and this is how the energy is consumed by different countries. The largest energy consumer in the world is China by far. It used to be at US till a decade back or so, but now China has overtaken it because it uses energy like anything. The US is having the second place, and after US we are quite far occupying the third place, and just next to us is then Russia, Japan, Canada, Germany, South Korea. Now let us also try to understand like what would be the amount of energy that is consumed by a few major countries. Now let us just talk about like the 5 top countries. Let's talk about China. China maybe is consuming 155 exajoules of energy. Then comes in US, which might be consuming roughly 90 exajoules of energy. In India, this might be 35 exajoules of energy. Russia again 30 exajoules of energy. And then comes in Japan, consuming roughly 15 exajoules of energy. If I total the energy consumption of the top 5 countries, this would roughly come to around 325 exajoules roughly. It could be like plus minus 10-15 exajoules here and there, but this is the amount of energy that is consumed by the top 5 countries. So what I am trying to say here is 50% of the energy globally is consumed by just 5 countries. Now this could be something that is not such a good fact, because just 5 countries of the 180 plus countries globally are consuming more than 50% of the energy. Well, if you also consider the population of these countries, among these, one of the most populous countries in the form of India, next is China, and US also tends to have a population of 30 crores or so. So among these we also tend to have a huge population that is consuming this energy. So if you calculate the population, you will also come across that these 5 countries also tend to be home of roughly 40 to 50% of the global population. So it makes sense that like 40 to 50% of the population globally is consuming 50% of the world's energy. So far so good. But these things change when we consider the per capita energy consumption. So if I go with per capita energy consumption, which you can see on the y-axis in the form of kilowatt hour, and again we have a host of other countries that are given on the x-axis. This is how the energy consumption changes. So if I talk about the countries which are consuming huge on a per capita basis, I would have countries like Qatar, Singapore, Iceland, which are not the largest consumers on an absolute scale, but if I consider per capita basis, they are consuming energy like anything. If I talk about China, this is where China is way behind a lot of countries. If I talk about the US, here we have the US almost consuming double the energy on a per capita basis from with respect to China. If I consider other countries like Russia, we have Russia in here greater than China, but of course lesser than the US. And if we consider ourselves in India, this is where we are, almost 1/3 of the world average. So although we might be the 3rd largest consumer of energy globally, our per capita consumption comes out to be very less. We are not even near the world average, and this is again a reason that we should be worried about. Of course, people might tend to say that ours is a very polluting country, but if you see the per capita emissions, they are hardly a minuscule part of what anyone living in the US would be emitting. And if I consider that with a person living in Qatar, it's totally incomparable. So this is something that we should try to understand, that on a per capita basis, we are still consuming a very less energy. And this also entails that the emissions on a per capita basis will also tend to be low. So if I see the CO2 emissions on a similar basis, so on the y-axis you have the per capita CO2 emissions, and again these are the same countries. So we in India are here, we are again way less than the world average, almost like 1.5 to 1.7 times of the world average is China. Then if I consider the US, let me see where this US is. Yeah, so we have the US in here having considerable emissions again, but the Middle Eastern countries which have huge access to these fossil fuels like Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, consuming these resources like anything. So again, if the aim of a common person living in a country is to live a lifestyle which is equivalent to the world average, this would entail the rise in this CO2 emission, which is why we need to be worried about, because if this energy consumption rise has to be there, it has to be coming at the expense of certain energy resources, and what if this energy resources is releasing more CO2 emissions? So that is going to be a problem for all of us. Further, we also need to understand, of course, this is how the energy is getting consumed in different countries globally, but how is this energy produced among the different countries around the globe? So if we see the major producers of energy, of course, we have the OECD bloc, which is the developed world, which is producing a great chunk of energy globally. Then comes in China. China is not only a big consumer, it is also a big producer of energy. Of course, we would have the non-OECD Asia, of which we are a part, and then comes in the other Middle Eastern countries. We can also try to list down what are the major countries that are producing the energy. So if I try to list then the top countries that are the top energy producers, they go as China, the US, Russia, Saudi Arabia, India, Canada, Indonesia, then comes in Australia, Iran and Brazil. So note down there is a huge disparity between the countries which are a major consumer and producer of energy. Suppose Saudi Arabia, it's a major producer of energy, but if I talk about the consumption, the absolute consumption tends to be small. Something goes with countries like Canada, Indonesia and Australia as well, and this is something that we should be worried about. The same fact could be understood with the help of another infographic that you can see in front of you. So basically what we have tried to do is we have tried to divide the world into 5 different blocks. One is the Americas, like the North and South America taken in together, the Europe, the Russia, the Africa and the Middle Eastern countries, and then we have the Indo-Pacific region comprising of India, China, Southeast Asia and Australia. So if you talk about the US, the colors of the circle basically tends to give you an indication whether this region is energy surplus or energy deficit. If the color is red, it means it's an energy deficit, which means it's importing the energy from other regions. And if the color is blue, which means this is energy surplus region, which is trying to export energy to other regions as well. And the diameter of this circle basically represents the quantum of surplus or deficit that is there. So, if we consider the Americas, and among them the US is one of the largest consumer of energy. If I consider the year 1990s, it used to be a deficit, but it became slightly positive in the 2017s, and going future in the next 15 years or so, this is going to be an energy surplus region. One of the reasons that is attributed to it is, like, in the past the US used to import a lot of petroleum products from the Middle East, but now with its own shale oil and shale gas resources, it wants to export it, and with the crude prices being on a higher range, it can easily derive a good profit. So this region doesn't tend to have much of a problem. Then coming to the Europe. Now, Europe has a good amount of developed world which is having very affluent lifestyle, and also they tend to consume a great amount of energy. So, if I consider in the past, maybe 25 years in the past, they were energy deficit. Today they are energy deficit, and they are expected to be energy deficit in the future as well. And this is one of the reasons why Europe is having a huge problem because of the ongoing crisis which is going in the Middle East and in the Ukraine region, because this has basically hampered the supply of cheap energy that they were getting otherwise. And this is also responsible for the economic changes that is happening in this region. Then we have another region which is the Africa and the Middle East. They tend to have huge amount of crude resources. The Middle Eastern countries are quite rich in it, so they were energy rich. They are currently energy rich, and in the future also they are not expected to face much of a problem. Something similar could be said for the Russian region, which was an energy surplus in the past and is expected to be energy surplus in the future as well. Now, the problem lies in the region of which we are a part of. We were deficit in the past, and we are expected to be even having a greater deficit in the future. So, if we would have to come across this problem of energy poverty, provide every living person with an honorable life, we would have to increase our energy consumption. And if these fossil fuels are the major source of energy, this is a problem, because this is where that we would have to rely on the foreign nations. Now, herein also comes the role of hydrogen economy. Now, if we would be going within a business as usual, this is how things are expected to look like. We are going to be even more dependent on other nations to meet our energy needs. But this thing can be changed if we move to another molecule which is not dependent upon these three sources like natural gas or crude. And this is what the hydrogen trade opportunities bring to us. This is a way in which India could become an exporter of energy from an importer. We have a huge amount of solar potential and wind potential. If these potential are used for production of green hydrogen, there are many countries which would want to import this hydrogen for their sustainable future. There are countries like Japan who would want to import hydrogen, which they are currently doing from Australia. Then there are a couple of European nations which are expected to be net importers like UK and Germany. There are countries who would want to be an exporter of this source of energy in the race, and some countries like Australia, other Middle Eastern countries, the US and the South Americas are eyeing these markets. And this is where India is also expecting to play a major role. They would want to see a change in the energy molecules, changing from the carbon based sources to hydrogen based sources. And given that we have a potential for renewable energy production, we might be able to produce green hydrogen at somewhat of a competitive price to give competition to the other suppliers, and we might be able to capture some of the global market, which helps us become an exporter of energy from the importer of energy. And this is what gives India a chance to change the geopolitics. And this is why so much of an emphasis is also given to the ongoing transition towards energy in the form of propagation of hydrogen energy. Further, we also need to understand different countries are going to utilize energy in different fashion. It's not going to be the same that all the countries are going to use majority of the energy in the industrial sector. So let us try to understand the energy consumption of the 5 major countries, being China, US, India, Russia and Japan. Now, if I talk about China, majority of its energy use goes into the industrial sector. quite understood because it has a huge industrial base. It's the factory of the world. Every other product that you are using is basically coming from China. Even if it is made in India, possibly the machinery has been imported from China, or there's a good chance that product is only assembled in India with the chips and all those major technologies coming in from China. Then another region where a majority of the energy is getting consumed again is the transportation sector, the residential sector. When I say about the non-energy use, I am basically talking about the production of fertilizers, insecticides or lubricants, and then there could be a few other uses as well. Now compare this energy use for a country like US. So when I talk about the US, where does it consume majority of the energy? It goes in the transportation sector. Now this is where the type of economies make a difference. Now US is basically a service based economy. They used to be a manufacturing hub, but majority of their income now comes from the different high-end services that they provide. So when you are a service-based economy, that also tends to involve a lot of travel. And US as such, people would want to travel by their own car. Even if they would want to go from the east coast to the west coast, they would love to drive, then take train or bus. So most of the public transport there runs in empty. And this is one of the reasons that majority of the energy is going into the transportation sector. And of course, they have a vibrant industrial sector as well. And they also tend to consume almost similar amount of energy in the residential sector. Now compare that. Now China has a population of roughly 130 crores or more. US has a population of 30 crores. But they are consuming the same amount of energy in the residential sector. Then comes us in India. We tend to again be consuming energy majorly in the industrial sector, which is again small as compared to China and the US. If I consider the transportation sector, even more small. One of the reason here is that the number of vehicles that we have in India is quite minuscule as compared to the other countries. And further, a lot of us would want to prefer public transportation. If you go by the railways or the buses, they are normally full, running at the full capacity or even overloaded. Compare that with the US where they are running almost empty. So we are making much more efficient utilization of the transportation sector as compared to other countries. And of course, we tend to be consuming, we have a huge population and we are consuming somewhat of energy in the residential sector, which again is comparable to Russia, which tends to have a very small population as compared to us. Now Russia also has a good industrial base and consumption in the residential sector, but given the population is small, we on a per capita basis, we are way behind. So one thing we learn from this exercise is that these are the main sectors where energy is getting consumed, but even among these sectors, there could be a wide disparity how this energy is getting utilized. And this also plays a major role how the different countries are going to formulate their hydrogen policy. If I talk about the US, possibly they would want to utilize a hydrogen source for transportation sector. China might be more aimed towards the industrial sector. We in India might want to focus on the residential sector. So policies of one country might be very different from the other one. The production of hydrogen could be very different from the different countries, and this is something we need to understand. So with this, let us take a break for the current lecture, wherein we are trying to understand the consumption pattern of energy among the different nations and its population, and we try to understand there could be different nuances that could be there as far as the energy consumption is concerned. Thank you.